having. This is a first part in a mini-series, so if you guys didn't already realize that, there are 3 other sessions that we'll be hosting here the next consecutive Wednesdays. Our session today is going to be an overview of boiling water canning, all of the things that you kind of need to know to get you started, all the safety aspects, the tools that you might need, and all the resources that are available to you, not just here at the library. I did pull some books, but also through some other resources at OSU Extension, as well as we'll go into it in detail when I get there, but I don't want to give away too many things on my first slide. My name is Margie House. I am an outreach program coordinator at the Extension Service located at the fairgrounds here. We are part of Oregon State University. We are your branch to the university, essentially. Outreach program coordinator sounds kind of vague. I think they like to keep it that way because once they find out that you like to do things, they just keep throwing things your way. So I started out there as the 4-H agent. I still oversee the local Curry County 4-H youth development program, but I'm also the overseer of the Master Food Preserver program, which is a part of Family Community Health. And I also have my hands in some early childhood education and care in Curry County. So if you're ever looking for answers to basically anything that keeps you thriving in your community, the OSU Extension Office is the place to be to get your questions answered. But let's talk about boiling water canning. How many of you have done some food preservation? Yeah? Pretty much everyone's kind of tried it. What brings you here today?
To hear it from somebody who knows what she's doing.
Hoping that I'm doing it right, and I haven't been sick, but yeah.
I requested a program like this, so that's why.
Awesome, cool. Here I am. I hope I deliver. Anything else? Anything unusual you want to find out? I just want to know I'm going to hit all the topics too. Okay, so. Like I said, it's an overview. Sometimes when we do these classes in our office, we do a hands-on portion as well. This is strictly a lecture piece, but I hope for it not to be too boring. So please, if you have questions, I am up here to answer them. If I don't have the answer, I'll find it for you. So we'll go over the equipment, processing procedures, all of those safety requirements. So you know you're doing it right from someone who has some answers potentially, right? I hope I do. So when we're talking about boiling water canning, it's specific to only high acid foods. There's only a few things that you can safely preserve at your homes using this process, and that is everything in that red zone there. So we've got tomatoes, which coincidentally are very low on the acid level, which is why you have to acidify them. You'll notice that a lot of recipes nowadays for two things actually, tomatoes and Asian pears require you to add lemon juice or a different method of acidification. And that's mainly because our soils don't have the same components as they used to, and we've got a lot of uniformity in our genetics of our vegetables and fruits that nowadays, so the acids aren't the same. So in order to safely preserve them in your boiling water bath canner, you have to acidify tomatoes and Asian pears. That's the other floating fruit up to its right. And then jams, jellies, pickles, preserves, marmalades, those sorts of things are all also categorized as being a food that's safe to pressure, or to can not in a pressure canner. How does it work? It is a relatively safe and easy practice as long as you're doing it right. We get a lot of phone calls that people will say, well, I heard all of them ping. I heard that lovely little noise, and there is gratification in that noise as they're in your kitchen, but that is not a sign that you have safely preserved your food. All you're hearing is the process of the vacuum seal. So if you ever wanted to vacuum seal something in a canning jar and not have to worry about whether or not you preserved it, you can suck all the air out of a jar that you want. That does not mean that it's safe to eat. So what does make it a safe process? It is the time that it's in there, it's the type of product that's in the can, it's the size of the product that you've cut up, it's all of the ingredients, and those recipes that you follow are going to be something that you can't play with. And we'll talk more about that when we go over recipes. So, you know, they're heated to a specific temperature that kills bacteria, that kills any sort of organisms that are in the food. And so you can't shorten your time. You can't speed things up. You can't take shortcuts when you're canning. So essentially what it is following a recipe to the T, getting it to the right time, right temperature, right consistency, and then obviously it does need to seal. So that paint does have a step in the process, but it is not the end-all be-all. So I mentioned the recipe is very important, and like I said, we do hear this all the time. I've always done it this way, I haven't killed anybody yet. Or, you know, this is my grandma's recipe, and she's all, you know, we ate this growing up. That's great, but for some demographics out there, even the slightest bit of foodborne illness can have catastrophic outcomes for them. And so that demographic are the elderly, young folks, so kids under the age of 1, I like to say even under the age of 5, your pregnant women, anyone who has a compromised immune system or might have some sort of other ailment that compromises them in a way that they're just not able to combat any sort of bacteria that gets into their systems. So where do you find these recipes? Where do you guys find recipes for your canning?
Found at least one online.
From what?
At least one online, just, you know, something looked good, so we tried it.
Okay, that's a little frightening for me. Pinterest is wonderful. I love it. I have so many pinning boards. I do not recommend you find canning recipes on Pinterest. That's why I was looking through some of these books as I pulled them out. You'll see some disclaimers in them, and some bloggers will put disclaimers on theirs as well, because there's a huge liability factor in putting this stuff out here. So this one says, all recommendations are made without guarantee on the part of the author. The author and publisher disclaim any liability in connection with the use of this information. And so you'll want to kind of look at the front of some of these books to find out whether or not you want to use specifically their canning recipes. Recipes for cooking, things for, you know, freezing food aren't going to be as detrimental to you. If you're doing pickling and you aren't canning it and it's a refrigerator pickle, I would not be afraid of using one of these books. But the amount of everything from sugar, salt, times involved in things are all scientifically tested by specific entities. So anything that has like a .edu is going to be really good. I totally didn't write this down for you, so I need to... Not edu. So Oregon State University has a website. I'm going to just spell it out for you, not letter for letter, but words, because they're fairly easy here. So extension.oregonstate.edu/mfp/publications is a great place for you to find recipes, to find troubleshooting information for everything that you forget that we talk about or that I forget to tell you today, that we have out there from the university for you. The National Center for Home Preservation is another resource that you can trust. It's from the USDA. So it's their acronym, NCHFP.uga.edu. And the tried and true ball canning. Ball canning has been around for ages. They do rigorous testing on all of their recipes. Ball canning, so it's the folks that make the canning jars. They also have lots of beautiful books. They too, though, will publish updates, and so you do want to take a look back. We tell people that anything that's not current makes really great home kitchen decoration, but not necessarily great for canning or cooking. This new one is fabulous, though. It has some really great varieties in it and beautiful pictures. I can show you guys, if you take a look at these, they don't have these here, but they are easy to find online, and maybe even within the coastline system. Our office also has a small amount of these books for sale. This I call my home preservation Bible. It has everything under the sun, not just canning, but dehydrating, pickling, fermenting. This is put together by the University of Georgia. So all land-grant universities throughout the state have an extension service, and the majority of them also have a branch that does home food preserving and food safety. Those are all trusted resources as well. So if you see another university out there with canning info, I would trust them. And they might have more variety than we do. I'm not even sure, but we sell these in our office if you're interested in looking at it. Pardon me?
What's it called?
This is called So Easy to Preserve. You can only get it through the University of Georgia. And we buy them in bulk. I think they're $20 or $25 at our office. So we have a few of these if you guys want to look at it, pass it around. Not trying to make sales, just trying to tell you that is a complete and wonderful resource to have in your kitchen. They make good Christmas gifts too. So temperature, acidity, measuring liquids to solid ratios are all tested when you're coming from a good resource. So food safety-wise, what are we trying to prevent when we preserve food in the process of canning? And those four things are mold, yeast, bacteria, and enzymes. Essentially, as soon as you harvest something, it is spoiling. So why do we preserve things? To stop the process of spoiling. These are the four main contributors to that. The good thing, the fabulous thing about boiling water bath canning, and why I call it like your kind of the gateway to food preservation, is that you aren't going to come across the big hitter. So botulism is what we're really scared of when we're canning. Low acid foods, if you're not already, or if you're past that fear of your pressure canner, you're now into the fear of killing people with botulism, right? When you're working with high acid foods, it's very unlikely that you're going to have to deal with that as a factor. The scary thing about that is you can't smell it, you can't taste it, and it lives all over the place. So it's in our dirt, it's in our food. It exists. It's a bacteria, good or bad. It's just there. So what I meant by it's a good thing to start here is that molds are something you can see. They're fluffy, they grow on food, we kind of all know what to look for. You know, you go in the back of your refrigerator and see something that you completely forgot about, and there you got some mold. Those are destroyed by temperatures between 140 and 190 degrees Fahrenheit. And while you're canning, it's going to get to that temperature. If you've done it right, it's going to penetrate to the center of that jar of food, and all of your product is going to have been, processed to the point where anything that's going to cause mold to occur is gone, the microorganisms. Yeast also thrives in both low and high acid environments, but that's another thing you're going to realize that it's there. Yeast is what creates fermentation, the process of fermentation. So sometimes you'll notice like an off odor. It might cause your food to get a little slimy. You'll just know it's not right to eat. We always say, when in doubt, throw it out. So if you've ever got any slight inkling of like, don't take one for the team because you have an ironclad stomach, just get rid of it. Someone in your household is like, I never get sick, I eat these things, and I wouldn't. Bacteria in our foods grow and multiply quickly, especially at room temperature. So if you've not processed correctly or one of your jars didn't seal all the way, that's just going to be the most wonderful environment for that bacteria to just proliferate, right? That's another thing that typically you can smell. Your food gets a little soft. It's going to look off. You might have some squirting when you open the jar. It's going to like at you. Don't need it. Don't need it. But the bacteria botulism is the big fear, and that's only killed at 290 degrees Fahrenheit. Home canning is really only going to get to that point if you're pressure canning. So you don't really have to worry about it when you're boiling water bath canning, but know that it's out there and it can be destroyed. Enzymes are a chemical that are in our foods. They're also in our bodies. They're what help aid with the digestion process. They're also what break down and spoil, make food spoilage. You inactivate that process in a number of ways when you're canning. Has anyone ever done like a pre-treatment to a fruit before canning or dehydrating? That's a method of pre-treating. Can be done by like blanching something, by doing like a sugar glaze. All of those things stop the process of enzymes. It inactivates them, as does the heating process of canning. It doesn't completely stop them, so that's why foods continue to deteriorate while they're in your jar. They say eat them within a year, because it's not necessarily a safety thing, it's a quality thing. The quality of your food after a given point of time is just not going to be where it would be, a year ago. Doesn't mean it'll kill you, though, which is a good thing. So getting started, if you don't already have some of these pieces of equipment in your kitchen, don't be intimidated. You don't need a ton of tools to get you started. The canning aisles at places like Bimart can, really catch your eye with some of those newest gadgets out there. But, keep it simple if you're just getting started. You need a large metal, why am I completely blanking on what's called kettle? Boiling bladder, canner. You need a canner. We're here talking about canners. That has enough space above your jar when it's in there for 2 inches of water above the jar to boil. So think about if you're going to do quart jars and you need an inch or two of water above it, and then you need about 2 more inches above that for the water to be boiling, for it not to spill all over the place and to create enough pressure on the top of your jars from the boiling water to create the vacuum seal. So they need to be relatively deep unless you're doing just half pints or quart pints. It has to have a tight fitting lid on it. Way back when, they used to have open kettle canning. That's no longer approved as a safe method, so it does have to have a tight fitting lid. If you have a surface range that's flat, like those electric glass ones, make sure you take a look at the bottom of your canner, because a lot of them have like the rippling. You want it to have a flat bottom on it if you have a flat top. And that's just because of the surface area and uniformity of heat. So that's the same goes for, you will only want about 4 inches on each side. So the diameter of your canner and the diameter of your heating mechanism, only 4 inches extra. Anything more than that, you need a smaller vessel or a larger heating surface. I will warn you, though, that they really don't recommend you use those outside gas propane burners. I use mine when I can, though. You have to be very vigilant. And it's primarily for when you're pressure canning, because when you're pressure canning, you don't put as much water in your canner, and you're more likely to run your kettle dry because of the high, BTUs, the amount of heat that it produces is more than the aluminum of the kettles. I know there's another, is there another pot? I want to call it a pot or something. So a lot of considerations for the actual kettle itself, including they do make some attachments for your electric burner. So some of those coil burners will actually turn themselves off if the range gets too hot. So think about those like extra 4 inches on either side. A lot of new units, like the surface, if it gets to a certain temperature, will just shut itself off. So they make these attachments that sit your burner a little higher up, and I think it's just like the airflow and it not sitting directly on the surface or close enough to it that it'll prevent that from happening, or at least it should. They'll tell you to check with your manufacturer, because a lot of them will tell you whether or not you should be canning on those surfaces. Your glass top surfaces, some of them will actually tell you not to do boiling water canning on them, because think about how heavy that's going to be on some glass. Say you've got a whole thing of quart jars in there and all of that water, you might crack it and then you have to break the bank to fix it. So those are the considerations for your actual kettle, and you need to have a rack that fits neatly in there. A lot of them will come with their own rack. If it does not, and you're using just a pot from home with a tight-fitting lid, and you're just doing some small batch canning, which you can do in like the same thing that you boil your pasta in. I've done it in a pinch where I've put a dish towel in there. As long as it's not sitting directly on the bottom of your canner, you're going to be okay. There's some other like DIYs for that too, where you wall up some foil. But what you risk yourself doing, especially with your dish towel or anything that's unstable underneath your jars, is any kind of shifting or movement in the jars will cause the liquid in there or the product to kind of seep out, and then you might not get a tight seal. So try to find a rack that fits. When you're boiled water canning, you cannot double stack. So when you're pressure canning, you can. If you're just boiled bath canning, you cannot double stack. Science behind it is there. Don't test me on it. I'd have to look up the answer. It's just something I'm supposed to relate to you. So you need a 2-part lid and ring. Nowadays, the manufacturers of those have changed the compound that they use for the sealing on the ring, or on the lid part, so you don't actually have to boil those anymore. You should still sterilize the actual fastener, the ring part, but you don't have to do that with the lid necessarily, but always check the manufacturer box. If you have old lids of rings that you're using, because you can reuse your rings over and over, so long as they're not rusted or have too many dents in them from someone like myself who takes a knife and whacks on it to open it up when her husband's not around to open jars. You gotta check on those things. The older ones might have that compound that does need boiled, but you'll also have a higher failure rate if you're not using the lids and rings that are just the lids. Let's just say the lids. If you're not using the lids that are purchased in that year that you're canning, they've been sitting on the shelf, they may have dried out, they may have gotten moisture in there. You can still use them, but be prepared for the potential for a failure rate and then having to reprocess or just end up freezing what you were trying to put in your cupboard. A jar lifter, which is the little tong deal up there. You need one of those to get your jars out. A funnel is extremely handy for making sure that you don't splatter on the sides of your jar, and for measuring. A lot of them these days actually have the measurements for where to fill to hit a certain headspace, so that when you're pulling it out, it goes perfectly because the lines are on the inside. I love those. That's a nice to have, not a needed thing. So I don't think that these, I will tell you right now, this is a ring tightener. That's not necessary. I mean, we've got these, right? So a lot of the kits just come with these things. I would call that a nice to have. The magnetic lid deal is nice because you're not risking transferring any bacteria from your hands onto the jars. I really think they were used more for when you had to heat your lids, but I would still recommend using them just as a food safety precaution because you've gone through all of those other rigorous ways of not getting bacteria and microorganisms into your product, so you might as well use that magnetic seal. Plus it makes you feel kind of dainty when you do it, so it's kind of fun. Other things that you need a ladle, you need whatever you've got to process the product. So if you're doing apples, you can get a quarter. You can also just do that by hand. Measuring spoons, you're going to need a set of those, at least a tablespoon usually, especially if you're acidifying something. Pot holders, a lot of these things you already have in your kitchen. A way to keep time, so a timer, your cell phone. Actually, you all got one of these handouts. So OSU has a free app that you can download to your phone, and it has not only recipes, but also includes a timer and a step-by-step guide for you. So you've got, in your kitchen, maybe you've got like your tablet in there or something, and you can just swipe through and it tells you exactly what to do. You say, I've got tomatoes, and I want to make salsa. And they'll show you all the different salsa recipes they have available. You just click on it, and it walks you through the process, including a timer, which is awesome. So, and it's free. And then you'll need paper towels or something to wipe off the rim of your jars, too. I would argue that this list is, etc. You can go on and on. Again, some nice to have, some necessary, depending on what it is you're processing. Make sure I didn't miss anything. Well, jars. Let's talk about our jars. If you're reusing something, and even if you're getting them brand new, always check your jars for any defects. I like to just pull mine out. I run my finger around the top of it, check for any nicks, any cracks, look around it. You can sometimes see the cracks, you sometimes can't until the whole bottom is popped off of your jar. That happens all the time. A lot of times that actually happens because you've done something like a jelly and you're taking a metal knife to get the jelly out. A lot of times you're just constantly going around to scoop it out like this, or you've got a spoon going in there, and glass is a memory, and so you're just perfectly creating this nice ring in there, and then the heat hits it and it's like right there. So check your jars for cracks and nicks, and those do need to be sanitized before you use them, and if you're doing a hot pack, you do need to keep them warm. You can do that in your dishwasher. If you're just going to sanitize them on your stovetop, you boil them for 10 minutes in a vigorous boil. You can keep them warm in your oven, or you can keep them warm in that water. That's a little messy and a lot of room on your stovetop though, so I sometimes do that, and then I'll take them out one by one and pop them into my oven and keep them hot. Has anyone ever seen those reusable lids? They're called tattlers. I don't recommend them, so I'm glad you're not using them. You can, but what it is like this plastic ring with the rubber gasket and then the ring that goes on it. You have to do all of that. So, you've got that little magnetic thing to just put that little nice ball lid on there, or whatever brand you're using. Or you have to fumble around with this little rubber gasket and then the plastic thing. And some people like that because it's reusable. But you also have to keep track of all those little things. And for me, that's not a win. Maybe that is for you. You can use them. They're harder to find out. You don't get that ping. You don't get that little, so you don't necessarily know if you've got the seal. So they're out there. We always kind of mention them just in case. There are other forms of kettles out there as well. There's steam canners and electric canners. We do not recommend the steam canners. They haven't done enough testing on them for OSU to say, or actually any extension service to say we recommend them, because there's differences in like cold pockets in the steam and not consistency in the heat on the jars. The electric canners, if you have one, received one, or thinking about one, you can only use the recipes that come with that device. and they're limited, so that might be a deciding factor for you as well. Those things are also very expensive and take up a lot of room on your countertop. One other thing that is a necessary for equipment too is something to get air bubbles out of your jars. So if you're doing like a fruit, you have to remove air bubbles from it, and it needs to either be wood or plastic. We don't recommend metal because it'll make the jar. Okay, so we have all of our equipment, and we have found the recipe that we trust. And now we're getting ready to can. The first thing you always want to do, and just rule of thumb when you're in the kitchen in general, is always review that recipe from start to finish. You never want to get to the middle of the process or at any point after starting and realize that you don't have something that you need that's completely vital to the end product, especially since this is a time-consuming process. It's going to take you about 2 to 3 hours minimum to can anything, in my opinion, and don't want it to really take all day. That time is also factored into the whole entire process. So if you got your applesauce to the point where you've milled it, you've cooked it, and it's at that consistency that you want it, and then you realize you don't have the right size lids for the jars that you're going to use, and you have to go to the store, you can't just turn that kettle of applesauce that's ready to be put in the jars off and come back and just put it in. You have to reheat it, you have to reheat your jars. Everything has to be at the right spot and right place and time for it to be fully safe at the end. So be prepared, have everything you need. Gather and assemble everything. Wash your equipment. There's some tips out there for how to wash your kettles and keep them dry. So when you store them, they say, wash it with soapy water, warm soapy water, dry it out. When it's completely dry, store it with like some balled up newspaper or some paper towels laid in there between like the bottom of it and your rack to soak up any moisture that might be in the environment. And we know that there's lots of moisture in our environment out here. A lot of things are subject to rust and mold and mildew. And the more you can prevent that, the longer your equipment is going to last. Sometimes those aluminum ones, like the blue one that they showed up there, can get some like black crusting in it, some corrosion. Cream of tartar. So you take like a tablespoon of that and a quart of water and you boil it in there, and it softens it all up, and you should be able to wash it right out. I haven't tried it. I found it written in my Bible, wherever it went, right there. It's so easy to preserve, and I thought that's a tip to pass on. I do nothing more than make snickerdoodles with cream of tartar, so I didn't know it had other uses. Want to make sure when you're gathering the product that it's as fresh as it can be. You never want to, I've got all these bruised up things, and that's not going to be the great end product for you. So it's quality in, quality out. When you're gathering all of your things, think about your ingredients as well, and make sure you're washing them. Some of the books will tell you, or some of the resources will tell you different ways to wash different fruits. So like your berries are washed completely different than like an apple. Like you never want to soak a raspberry or a blackberry. You'll just want to rinse them off and towel dry them, but you can soak other fruits. Just make sure you read the recipe. If it is a trusted source, it'll tell you exactly how to deal with that product. Talked about having enough space to boil in. So when you're getting ready, you want to preheat your canner. Particularly important when you're boiling, doing boil water canning, because there's a lot of water that's got to get going in there, and you don't set your timer for that canning process until that water is boiling after you've put the product in there. So it's good to get your water boiling. You're going to take some time to get to know the kettle that you're using, because the displacement of water when you put different sized jars in and different things in there is just going to cause the water to rise at different levels. So it might take you some time to figure that out, get to know your canner. But When in doubt, fill it about halfway and have another source of boiling water going at the same time. One thing that we do at our office when I do that is we've got one of those big coffee tureens that just like pours out coffee, and I just stick straight water in there. So if you've got one of those quick boiling water things, those are great, so you don't have to have 2 big boiling kettles going. But it helps you get to that point where you can start timing faster if you have that second backup boiling water on hand. We mentioned having to sterilize your jars and your rings or lids, but that's 10 minutes, like I said. So get everything ready if you're processing and it's going to be a hot pack rather than a cold pack. Keep those jars warm after you sterilized them. And again, that'll tell you in your recipe whether or not you need a hot jar, and you'll know that if you've read it. So we are ready to pack our jars, assuming we follow the recipe part, and that's not necessarily the hard part, right? So processing the apples to the point where they're going in the jar, or the pickles. It's not, the process isn't the hard part. If you're comfortable enough to be in the kitchen and you're canning, I would hope that you're also just comfortable with a recipe that says, you know, you're making a brine and you're boiling some water with some vinegar and some salt and some sugar. But again, never change those recipes. Never say, my diet calls for less sugar than this, or my diet calls for less salt than this, and so I'm not going to add it. The majority of your high-acid products require the amount of sugar or the amount of, usually not the salt, unless you're pickling. Pickling the salt is extremely necessary, but the sugar in your jams and jellies is where people always try to cut back. Yeah?
About the salt, because I have a salt requirement, but you know, we did some pickles, and after we were done following the recipe exactly, the pickles were inedible because they were so salty. It was just like they came out of the Dead Sea.
So I would want to see where your recipe came from.
One of those places out in the ozone.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a specific ratio, in particular for pickling, which one of the classes we're doing is pickling in the series, so you should definitely look for that and come. There's a specific ratio for how to preserve them. I wouldn't know without seeing the recipe whether or not it was above that ratio with salt, or if you are just sensitive to that because you avoid salt, which could be the case as well.
A couple of us.
Yeah, so we get a lot of calls about sugar and jams and jellies. There are low sugar options out there. There's alternative recipes for things like using alternative sweeteners, honey being one of them. Flavors change, consistencies change, but if that's what's right for your diet, that's what's going to be good for you. Find a trusted recipe that supports that. Don't amend something that's out there. You won't have a catastrophic safety issue because it is a high-acid food. Like I said, you're not going to kill someone with botulism. You'll see anything that's really wrong with it. When I went through my training, they basically said, you still need to tell people that's not the right practice, but they aren't going to kill anyone. But it just won't turn out right. A lot of people will say it turned into a syrup, it didn't really set up, and there's just this balance. It's like a fine art that goes with all of the ingredients. So make sure you look at all that. So you're packing your jars. Is it a hot pack or a cold pack? There's a difference in the outcome of the product depending on one of those. Obviously, one of them's going to be softer than the other, right? But you're also going to be able to fit more in a jar if you're hot packing it. It's softer, it fits more in it. But you never want to fill it more than your recipe calls for. It's just an easier way to get rid of a lot of things. If you've got like 40 pounds of apples, I don't know, it depends what you like to eat, how much you have time-wise, a lot of factors go into it. We heated our jars. We're checking for a headspace requirement. That component is actually really important. I've seen people bring in jars of things that they've canned as gifts, and I'm like, oh, the headspace is a little, wow, it's below the neck of the jar. They're lucky it's sealed. That means that there's more airspace that needs to come out that wasn't accounted for in the processing time. if you overdo it, you can have stuff spill out, you don't get a seal. You got another handout in your packet, that orange one, that has, I'll go back to it, has this awesome little chart for you. So that if you don't have one of those measuring tools, it shows you, like for jams and jellies, you've got to get to that 1/4 inch headspace for it to be where they're telling you to put it. And it's like nothing. It's that top rung of your rim of the jar. But proper fill is actually a very important component. Specifically, too little can cause siphoning, too much can cause a seal to not happen because there's so much air that needs to come out. The processing time hasn't accounted for that. Some deviation is okay. I will tell you that in a lot of the home canning recipes that are out there, they have a deviation of error for the home canner. So there's a little bit, tiny bit of wiggle room, but this is an important aspect that I make sure to have a separate handout for you because I refer to mine. I actually fold it up and I keep it in my Bible. So we avoid overfilling the jars. You've got that last tiny little bit and you just want to fill it all in. Try to fight that urge, freeze it, eat it right away. Don't overstuff the jars. Always, even if you don't see anything, wipe that rim of your jar with a damp cloth. Always a different side, not the same little finger space for all of them. We're just making a clean surface for that seal to happen. And then place on your lids and rings. When you're,
About the lids, I bought 3 different, packages of new jars, all sealed and everything, from 2 different stores.
Mm-hmm.
And when I opened them, the lids were already...
They're already sealed?
Yeah.
Yeah, that happens. So a lot of times that happens because of where they're stored.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's just a vacuum seal.
Yeah.
I've had that happen and used it and not had a failure rate, but that can just cause a higher failure rate. It's not unsafe to use it.
Okay, so even though there's that dent in there, you can still use it?
It pops back up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like I said, it's just creating the vacuum seal. You don't reuse your lids because that component that seals them is it's affected by the heat. So it helps that suction happen. But as long as that lid isn't dented in any way, like there's no crease in it or cracks in it, you should be fine.
Because they're really sealed on there. It's a real groove in there, and you take it off and it pops. And I've never seen that before.
So how old are they?
They were brand new, and had just bought.
Okay. And what does that? So you can bring it into our office, and I'd be happy to take a look at it for you.
I just went and bought new lids.
Yeah, that's an easy fix
I've never
too.
seen that before in my life, and
It happens to me all the time, especially if I'm canning in the summer and I leave my, I go to Ace and I buy a flat and I leave them in my car, or I stick them in the attic, which is where I hide all the things that I, don't want to have lying around the house. Fluctuation of heat can cause that. In the garage, yeah, fluctuation of heat. So when you put your ring on there, it's just finger tight. You're not cranking it down. That's why I don't think that little device is really necessary. Finger tight just means as you put the ring on and it catches, when you first start to feel it give, you stop. And the reason you need that is because air is escaping. If you have it on too tight, that air can't get out and it won't seal. Talked about headspace. Okay, and then we get to the point where we're processing. So assuming you plan ahead and you've got your water already boiling, you can go ahead and use those tongs. You definitely want to use the tongs at this point. Don't use your hands and try to just plop it in there. It's dangerous. So gently place them in there. Like I said, you cannot double stack. So have enough space around them where they're not touching one another because, think about it, they will be kind of getting happy in there. You want to have 1 to 2 inches of water above the jars. So if after you put them in there, the water doesn't displace enough for the water to have risen an inch or two, you have to add water into your canner. But then remember, you're getting it back up to a rolling boil, so you do need that space above it so that it's not squirting all over your stovetop, especially if you have a gas burner. It's going to turn that gas off.
I have a
Turn the fire
question
off.
on that one.
Yeah.
So lid off until the rolling boil,
Yes.
and then the lid goes on.
Yes. So you get it to the point where it is boiling again, you put that tight fitting lid on, and then you start your timer. Yes.
So when you said you have another container of water boiling,
Yeah.
when you pop that hot water,
Where do I what?
if you have 2 containers of hot water boiling, when do you add that other hot water?
So after you put all your jars in, if you don't have 1 to 2 inches of water above the tops of them, you add some in. Otherwise, you're adding tap water in, and then you've got to sit and wait for it to come to a boil again. And that's tedious, watching a pot boil. So, set it up on high, get it back to a boil. Yes?
Now, if you have a rocker, one of those, I guess it's a steam canner with a rocker.
So the rockers are on your pressure canners.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you can use your pressure canner as a boiling water canner as well.
See, I time
But
it
keep
when
the
it
vent
starts-
off.
When it
Keep the
starts.
vent off of it. Or
Right.
keep the thing off of it.
Well, then it's just shooting out steam.
Because you're not pressure canning. When you keep that on there, that steam is what builds the pressure inside of your pressure canner. So if you're using your pressure canner to boil water can, you want to take that off of there so the pressure doesn't build.
Okay. I haven't done the water, I've done the pressure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good question. Also, when you're looking at your recipes, make sure you're adjusting for any altitude differences. So processing times will change depending on your altitude. If you're not certain of your altitude, our office can also help you locate where you are on the grid to find out if you need to adjust. Anything over 1,000 feet is where you start changing your processing times. So you've got it all in there, you got it up to boil again, you follow the correct processing time for your altitude, and then you turn off your heat and you move it over, unless you have a gas burner, and then you get lucky and you just get to turn it off. Your jars need to sit in there for 5 more minutes. Those 5 minutes are a part of the processing time. A lot of times people discredit that and take them out right away. Don't. So let it sit, leave the lid on. After the 5 minutes are up, then you take your jars out. You'll need those tongs again, and when you're taking your jars out, how many of you tip the water off? Don't do that. That was one thing I learned in training that I was like, oh shoot, I've been doing that. It will actually evaporate itself off. And all that does is, when your jars are sitting out, that's when you start hearing them ping. They still haven't created that seal yet. And so if you're pulling them out and you're pulling them out at an angle, you risk anything kind of slipping out of there and then you don't get your seal. So as straight up as you can, you're kind of like a crane, you just kind of, and then down onto a heat-safe countertop. So, have a dish towel or I use just a towel from the bathroom and put it out, or whatever is going to protect the surface that it's going on. And leave at least an inch space in all directions around the jars as they come out. Don't tighten those rings, just leave them. Leave the water, leave the jars. You don't need to cover them. Drafts are okay. I've heard a lot of old practices of covering them with towels to prevent drafting. You actually want circulation of air around your jars for them to cool off. They say not to move them for 24 hours. And at that point, you take your rings off and you wash them. You can wash the rings, but you wipe off the jar themselves. So at this point, they've also cooled to the point where you can label them. And we do recommend that you do that with, what is it? When did you can it? You can go so far as to identify them as a batch. whatever that marking is for you. You know, it can just be like batch 1 on this date. That's because if something went wrong in that batch, you know which jars are affected. If throughout the season you've done different batches of the same product, you'll know which ones might be affected by whatever it is went wrong with that one jar. And then you just keep an eye on them or notice that they really need to go. If you are entering your product in the fair, they'll ask you for different kind of labeling. I believe it needs to also have on it the recipe that you followed. So that's something that if you're interested in, you can keep track of as well. That's also really nice information if you end up giving anything that you can as a gift to someone. I hope it doesn't come across rude of me when I ask people, oh, like what recipe did you follow? And I try to ask politely. But when you receive something from someone who's home canned a product, you do want to know that they've followed the correct process. And so it's nice of you to just offer that ahead of time. Anything that hasn't sealed, if you notice that any of the jars haven't sealed, you can place that in the refrigerator. If it's sat out for 24 hours, it's totally fine. Stick it in the refrigerator. Within the next 24 hours, you can reprocess it, or you can just freeze it. The contents are going to be fine if you freeze them, but they're also fine to sit out. When you store them, after you've labeled them, cool, dark, dry. That's basically anything you've preserved. That's the environment that it likes. Anything that fluctuates, like storing things in your garage, are going to have those really high and low temperature. You know, it gets really cold in the winter, really hot in the summer. Not going to be great for your canned goods. If you're using shelving that gets really high up, it's nice to have a lip on that shelf. Think about earthquakes out here, or you know, something bumps into your shelf and you lose all these glass jars. What a bummer that would be. And then it's best to use things within a year. They tell you not to really go overboard with how much of something you're canning, because you're supposed to only can what you can eat within a year. So don't hoard the food, you know, share it, share the love with people. It just doesn't get better as it sits longer, and you're probably just going to have just as much applesauce to make the next year or whatever it is you get in abundance of. I use applesauce because I'm still daily eating mine, so we'll eat. We talked a little bit about storage already, but make sure you wash everything afterwards. Those rings that come off, wash them and dry them. Don't store them like I do in a big tub, tub of something, because they rust. Mine have all become crafting items or toys for my children. The best way to store them is, you know, just get a line or get a rope or something and just sort of string them on there. Those can go in your garage. That's a great place for them, actually, because no one will really see them. But hang them to dry. That's the best place to do that. I told you all about putting newspaper in your deals. Inspect your jars before consuming them. So you've stored them, you've gone through all of that process to get them in the jars. Make sure before you eat them, you're taking a look at what they're looking like. If they're bulging, if they're leaking, any signs of spoilage, off odors or mold. Things like tomatoes, if you receive a jar of tomatoes from someone and they haven't acidified them, or you don't know whether or not they have, or you didn't, you can also, as a line of safety measure, heat it. So boiling it vigorously for 10 minutes, and then an additional 10 minutes per extra 1,000 feet of altitude is an extra safety measure for a canned, low-acid product. I mention it here only because tomatoes sometimes fall into that category. It's not a guarantee, but it's an extra measure of safety if there's an unknown factor of how it was processed. As in, someone gifted you tuna. That's what I wrote. Make a tuna casserole. It'll be good. So with that, we've kind of come to a conclusion here. It is winter. We don't necessarily have all the product out there to be canning, But if you have things in your freezer, like I do, this is the perfect time of year to make your jams and jellies. It's better than summer, honestly, because if you're trying to get juice out of a very seedy blackberry, all you have to do is take your frozen berries out and put them in like a colander, and all that juice just comes out very nicely for you. You don't have to actually juice it. So I always tell people winter is the time for jams and jellies. And your house doesn't get overheated and steamy. So I'll take any other questions or concerns that you have about something you may have already created at home. Yeah.
What about using, like we have hard water, how does that affect the family, either using it in the product or using it in the boiling water bath?
It's a quality thing, not a safety thing. So it could cause cloudiness, but it's not going to harm you. So you can go into town and get some city water somewhere, or use your hard water. You'll be okay. Cloudiness, that's about it. Anything else? Okay. Yeah.
Will you be doing any kind of workshop on maybe fermentation?
Just did one in October. The pickling workshop, or pickling seminar, or whatever we want to call it, lecture, I will touch on fermenting because it's a natural pickling process. Actually, that's a piece of that presentation. So yeah.
With fruits and veggies?
We'll just be talking primarily about vegetables in that class. There's a really awesome book that I actually saw on their shelves here, though. Do you have it? The Art of Fermentation. That's a fabulous fermenting book. Yeah, if you have questions, you can always use my contact information. I'm easily accessible most of the time on email. I'm sometimes out in the community on the phone, though.
She's very prompt on email. I sent her an email, she answered me within, 12 minutes?
Well, it's also really exciting because I, too, had gotten an air fryer for Christmas. So she would like to have an air fryer class. We've done Instant Pot classes before and slow cooker classes. And that's the new hot item. And I also got one for the holidays. So I love it. Yeah. We only have, there's 4 of us in my household, but like two and a half of us that eat in earnest. And so the small portion size that it cooks up is enough for my family. I feel like that would be a drawback for people with larger families, is if you were trying to use it for an entire meal, it would be
Did you get it at
annoying.
Walmart?
My mother-in-law got it for me. She probably got it on Amazon. A lot of Amazon box shops.
Does it work, Displace it there in the kitchen today? Another appliance.
I know. And so I've got my air fryer, my KitchenAid mixer, my Instant Pot, all in one place, we need a kitchen.
Egg rolls will win you over.
What's that?
Egg rolls.
Really? That's on my list to try too. Yeah. Because I bake my egg rolls.
Yeah.
So yeah, we should do that class. It sounds like that'd be fun. That'd be a good one too, where we've had where we have tasting sessions too, so you can taste some things.
What is the one next week, the class next week for?
Are
you doing that one?
It's all me. Thank you. So yeah, dehydration, pickling, and then am I doing an overview of pressure canning? Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah. I love taking suggestions for other classes. This is the time of the year, like I said, I oversee the 4-H program, so the summer when our harvest is happening is my busiest time of year with camp and fair, so I'm unable to get out and do these lectures then. But this time of year, it's on. I'm happy to do others.
Okay, so now that you've got my email address, are you going to notify me of some of these classes that you're doing?
Sure.
That'd be awesome.
Yes. Yeah. We have a running list that my office assistant takes care of, so I'll add you to it. Hopefully you get the info.
Yeah.
I love doing them here at the library because they've got an amazing setup. They've got the resources for you too. But in the future, if we do have any that are hands-on, they would be at our office. And if you don't know where we're located, we're on the fairgrounds, and you just drive towards the ocean. You see our big OSU extension sign and the whole meeting space in there that has a little mini kitchen. So
Thanks a lot, Margie.
Thank you.